Phillip. So in this video, we're going to talk about Nikolai Pogodin's play Kremlin Chimes. So this is very much a propaganda piece of socialist realism. It premiered in 1940, which is interesting because it is that was 16 years after the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, and this is very much a piece glorifying Lenin. So when I say it's a propaganda piece of socialist realism, there's two components to this, right? The propaganda element and the socialist realism component. And socialist realism itself has two major components, the socialism and the realism. So the propaganda aspect is, that's pretty straightforward, right? We generally have a broad sense, at least, of what propaganda is, right? It is material, art, rhetoric, communication that is in the service of a particular ideology or government or whatever it is, right? This is very much that. This is a play that glorifies Lenin, that glorifies the communist worldview, that identifies Lenin as this great visionary, which, of course, by 1940 was a fundamental component of the Stalinist system, right? And it is worth noting that Stalinism is different from Marxism-Leninism, even though it has the same basic roots, right? Sort of broad brushstroke. It's not that important, actually. I'm gonna put a pin in that, right? But Stalinism derives its legitimacy within the Soviet Union in part from the idea that Stalin is the inheritor of the Leninist tradition, right? And so this is built on a system of ideological devotion to Lenin. Lenin becomes somewhat like a martyr, somewhat like a saint, somewhat like a sort of visionary. In a way, it's not necessarily a terrible comparison to say that Lenin is sort of the George Washington of the Soviet Union. And Pogodin's play is very much within this tradition of sort of elevating Lenin. And there's some specific ways that it does so. But the most common way is by making Lenin almost sort of magically charismatic. He is intelligent, which, as far as I can tell, the actual Lenin was quite intelligent. He is cultured. He knows poetry and literature and philosophy. In addition to political economics and communist theory, he is concerned with the lives and the comfort and the safety of those in the Soviet Union. He is concerned with improving the country, most notably through an electrification project. Because Lenin is concerned in the play about the fact that so this is 1920 odd, I think this play is set. So really, maybe it's 1920. Yeah, no, I think it's 1920, but maybe slightly later. I don't think the date is specifically identified, but it's sort of latter stages of the Russian Civil War. And Lenin is concerned that Russia's electrical infrastructure, its power plants, etc., have largely been destroyed in World War I and then the Civil War, or that they were always sort of mismanaged and never intended to be equitable under the Tsarist system. Right? So we've got these sort of twin problems, right? You've had a devastating series of conflicts that's absolutely ruined Soviet infrastructure. And then you had a system under the Tsars that really utilized Russia's resources. And this is true to greater or lesser extents in some of the other areas, like Ukraine and places like this that became part of the Soviet Union. Or that became Soviet Socialist republics, etc. But you have this problem with pre-revolutionary Russia, where the monarchy, the central government, and the aristocracy utilize the nation's resources specifically for their own benefit, rather than for the sort of broad benefit of the Russian people. And Lenin, of course, as a good communist, is opposed to that. He believes in a system that will be beneficial for everyone. And so he wants the electrification of the whole country. And this is actually really quite an interesting one, because the thing that I, as an American, think of is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a project during the New Deal under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that brought electricity to parts of the United States, particularly in Appalachia, that did not previously have electricity. And it really revolutionized those areas. And we have the same kind of thing in Russia, right? This is actually a thing that people tend to forget about the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China and things like this, is for as authoritarian and violent and repressive as those regimes were or are, they also replaced a system that was comparably, though less technologically, repressive, violent, and much more unequal, that had higher rates of poverty and extreme poverty, that had much less access, where people on average had much less access to resources, etc., etc. So there is this sort of interesting element here, right, where it's Lenin, we get a very rose-tinted picture of Lenin. But Lenin also did a lot of good for the Russian people. If you compare, say, the conditions in which the average Russian lived in, say, 1912, prior to the start of World War I, to the conditions of the average Russian, say, by the 1960s, by the time that the Soviet Union had really sort of implemented a lot of its modernizations, it's a substantial improvement, right? So that's there. But again, Lenin is presented as this sort of saint genius of Marxism-Leninism, and particularly he is presented as someone who can inspire even those who do not believe in communism, such as engineer Zabelin. Zabelin is an anti-communist. He sort of starts out the play very much opposed to the Soviet regime, and eventually Lenin is basically like, hey, man, you're an expert engineer, and we need engineers. Like, you can keep doing what you're doing, or you can come work for us and like do the thing that you say you want to do. Like, we would love to have you on our side. And Zabelin's basically like, I'm not going to become a communist. And Lenin's like, that's cool. You don't have to. Which is, of course, not something that Stalin would have said by 1940. But, again, put a pin in that. So Lenin has this sort of amazing charisma, this amazing ability to persuade people, and he has this incredible connection with working class characters. So in this bit, for instance, this is the middle-ish of the play. Lenin and his sort of secretary, this guy who's this sort of general secretary dog's body type figure, Rybakov. And Rybakov is in a sort of tempestuous on-off relationship with Zabelin's daughter, and that's the sort of love story of the play. So Lenin and Rybakov are sort of walking along just outside at night, and they encounter these three workers. And Lenin has forgotten his watch. That becomes a big plot point because a big component of this play is that the Kremlin clock has stopped, right? And they have not been able to fix it. Lenin is trying to get it fixed. He's trying to get someone to come and work on this. And he sends Rybakov eventually to go and find somebody. So the senior worker says, before the Kremlin clock used to chime the hours, now it's silent. Lenin says, yes, and that's very bad. The Kremlin clock should never be silent. Sasha, find a clockmaker. That's Rybakov's first name. Sasha, find a clockmaker, one who knows how to handle ancient timepieces. Rybakov says, I'll find one, Vladimir Ilyich. Lenin says, it's a harder job than you think. A good many have already tried to repair the chimes and given it up. So this clock metaphor, this is an extended metaphor over the course of the play. It is a fairly straightforward one, I would say, in terms of what it's about, right? This sort of like, we need to repair the clock. The clock represents the sort of success of the Soviet state. Everybody's criticizing the Leninist government, the Bolsheviks, because the clock is broken and they haven't fixed it, right? And so this idea of it's a harder job than you think. A good many have already tried to repair the chimes and given it up. This represents the sort of the ideology of it will be difficult to create communism in Russia, in the Soviet Union, but we will keep working on it. We are dedicated to it. Rybakov says there must be someone who can do it. The bearded worker says, Comrade Lenin, don't go. Spend a few minutes with the working class. The senior worker says, I warn you, he's a great one for joking. So again, there's this sort of element of like, oh, Lenin, man of the people, right? Where like he's constantly hanging out with like hunters, gamekeepers and like estate managers, and he's hanging out with these workers randomly. He's always like talking to people, etc., etc. And this idea that like, oh, you don't want to get into it with Comrade Lenin. He'll make a joke. It is very like, right. The idea is really very much to be like, Lenin's a cool dude, right? Lenin is down to earth. He's the kind of head of state, head of the Communist Party whom you can have a beer with, right? I mean, you can't have a beer because it's Russia in 1920 and everybody's starving, right? There's no food, basically. But, you know, you get what I'm saying, right? So this sort of idea of like, oh, even the workers, even these random workers who are identified as senior worker, bearded worker, and apprentice, right? They don't even get names in the play because they are literally in only this scene. Like, even they are like, oh, yes, we're personal friends with Lenin, right? So that sort of element of like humanizing him. And Lenin says, so this is where it really starts to get very propagandistic, right? This next bit is really about sort of like portraying the working class as optimistic about the future in ways that inspire even Lenin, right? So Lenin says, "You still have the heart to joke?" The bearded worker says, "Why not? We've crushed capitalism, haven't we?" Lenin says, "Yes, but just crushing capitalism doesn't fill your belly." The bearded worker says, "Now we'll begin to build socialism." Lenin says, "Do you know how?" The bearded worker says, "The world's full of kind people. Someone will tell us." Lenin says, "There are plenty of kind people, but I wouldn't advise you to trust them all." The bearded worker says, "Oh, we're choosy. We'll trust the ones you do." Lenin says, "Do you suppose Lenin has never been mistaken in people? He's made mistakes too." The bearded worker says, "The important thing is we haven't been mistaken in Lenin." Lenin says, "It's much easier to destroy capitalism than to build socialism." The bearded worker says, "Is it, Vladimir Ilyich?" Lenin says, "We're the first to try. Nobody can show us how, and to make it worse, we're paupers for the time being." The bearded worker says, "That's true enough. We've grown poor." Lenin says, "We'll have to do all the building ourselves. No one will help us." Here we start to... the propaganda gets thick. So the bearded worker says, "There's nothing the Soviet power can't do. In the Bible, the people of Babylon wanted to build a tower to the skies. It was no go. Why? Confusion of tongues, it's written. But if you ask me, it was because they didn't have Soviet power then." Lenin says, "That's well said." The bearded worker says, "No joking, Vladimir Ilyich. Soviet power can do anything it has a mind to." Lenin says, "What makes you so sure of it?" The bearded worker says, "Let me tell you something. Not in a hurry, are you?" Lenin says, "No, sit down." And the bearded worker says, "Here you see 3 men, Moscow tram car workers, on night shift, the proletariat, neither saints nor sinners, ordinary folk. Under what other power would they would they work all night for a miserable crust of bread?" He takes a piece of bread from his pocket. "None. But as it is, we stumble along. If we fall, we lie there a while, then we get up and go on with the job. That's why I believe in the might of Soviet power." And the senior worker says, "Don't you think we've bothered Lenin enough? It's time we were moving on. We've plenty to do yet." And the bearded worker says, "Sorry to be so long-winded." And the senior worker says, "Good night, Comrade Lenin." Lenin says, "Good night." Then, to Rybakov, he says, "There's nothing like the ordinary Russian man, Comrade Rybakov. When you've lived as long as I have, then you'll really come to appreciate him. If Tolstoy hadn't spoiled it by inventing Tolstoyism, there'd be nobody to match him for his portrayal of the Russians. But the old fellow had no understanding of the workers. I don't feel like going home. You're in love. What do you suppose is wrong with me? If you want to know, I'll let you in on a secret. Sometimes I like to dream. I roam about alone, dreaming of unheard-of things. We shan't build towers to the skies, of course, but with a people like ours, we can dare, we can dream." So this is the other big component of Lenin's character in this play, is he's constantly talking about dreams, and everybody who encounters him characterizes him as a dreamer who can achieve his dreams.